What's up, guys? It's time for another classic review, and this is a movie that pretty much started the serial killer thriller craze of the 90s. Let's review the iconic Silence of the Lambs. Silence of the Lambs stars Jodie Foster, Anthony Hopkins, Scott Glenn, and is directed by Jonathan Demme. What is up, guys? Hope you guys are all staying safe out there. I got a classic review that I'm really excited to do for you guys. One of my patrons, Brandon Lewis, he requested that I review Silence of the Lambs. If you are of a certain tier on my Patreon group, then you can request a review. And thankfully, he requested this one because this is a classic. This is a groundbreaking film. This movie was #1 at the box office for 5 weeks straight. That's not something that happens that often these days, but the reason this movie did that was because of how well made it was. You know, every now and then we get a horror movie. This could be called a horror movie. I mean, there's definitely some horrific elements to it. But you get a movie like this that is, you know, really high A-level, like Oscar-worthy type material. You know, this isn't your everyday slasher fare, stuff like this. And it's nice, you know, in your horror sandbox to have different subgenres, and this being one of them. You know, the movies that I guess you could say are ones to be proud of. Silence of the Lambs is definitely that. As a matter of fact, I remember back in the early 90s, I was in my senior year of high school when this movie actually came out, and I remember all the buzz around it. This came out pretty close around the same time as like Terminator 2. And for some reason, I remember those two movies getting all the buzz. And I didn't get to see this in a theater. I saw like a VHS burned copy of it. Because remember back in the day when a movie would come out on VHS for rent, some folks would actually copy them to a blank VHS. So one of my friends had this movie and Terminator 2, funny enough, on the same VHS, and he loaned it to me, and I watched both those movies. Of course, I had seen Terminator 2 in the theaters before. But like I said, this was the beginning of that big serial killer boom. You know, all these thrillers started coming out. Even Seven, you know, owes a debt to Silence of the Lambs. But there were so many of these movies, actually. Some good, some not so good. But I think Silence of the Lambs stands apart from the pack because it really is a passion project. You can tell the work and care that went into this movie. Jonathan Demme directed this. Jonathan Demme is a very unique type of director. I always like to refer to him as like the Americana director. Every movie that he has done, there's like a stamp of Americana on it. You can even like notice a little bit of that like Midwestern feel to it. He's not that flashy, glitzy type of director. This is a director that, you know, gets dug in and likes to explore characters and locations that aren't necessarily the ones that we constantly see in cinema. You don't see like mansions and high-rise buildings and all this stuff. Like I said, this is like Americana. And one of the Easter eggs throughout this movie is there are American flags planted throughout the movie strategically. A couple reasons. One being that it is like a piece of Americana. And two, serial killers are widely an American phenomenon, especially back in like the 70s and 80s. You can scroll through like Wikipedia, and there are literally hundreds of serial killers, and many, if not most of them, are based out of America. So anyway, let's get into this wonderful movie. First off, quick plot synopsis. Our main character, Clarice Starling, played by Jodie Foster, she is actually an FBI trainee. She's still very wet behind the ears, and she's assigned this case for the Buffalo Bill killings. You know, this is a serial killer, played by Ted Levine, and he's one of those serial killers that's very deranged. He skins his victims. He cross-dresses, serial killer stuff. Jack Crawford sends her to speak to Hannibal Lecter, an already incarcerated Hannibal Lecter, to try to actually get inside the mind of Buffalo Bill and ultimately capture the guy. And the very tenacious Clarice, once she meets Hannibal Lecter, she becomes consumed with his knowledge and really just interested in him as a person. And she wants to stay on the case. So eventually what gets her the case is Buffalo Bill kidnaps another victim whose mother is a senator. So this character, Catherine. And we all remember Catherine from It Puts the Lotion in the Basket. She's the one that's in the well.
It rubs the lotion on its skin or else it gets the hose again.
Now, a lot of people didn't know when this movie came out that there was a previous movie based on Thomas Harris's novels called Manhunter. Manhunter came out in the 80s, and It's a great movie, actually. Stars William Peterson, directed by Michael Mann. And a lot of people, I think, went back and rediscovered this movie after Silence of the Lambs came out. I've even reviewed the movie quite a few years ago, actually. But the movie flopped at the box office. It really received no fanfare whatsoever. And so Dino De Laurentiis actually gave the rights away to Orion. And so, you know, I think 4 or 5 years later, Orion made Silence of the Lambs. And of course became this huge hit, won all these awards. And so eventually Dino De Laurentiis would go back and co-produce Red Dragon and Hannibal. Now, one thing I really love about this movie is Jonathan Demme's direction. The first scene in this movie really sets the tone of it too, because Clarice, she's going to meet Hannibal Lecter, and if you pay attention to the cadence of that scene, it starts off kind of light, even a little comedic. When she meets Chilton, who's the head of the prison, looks a lot like Nick Nolte, and he's the guy that makes Hannibal Lecter's life not a living hell, because Hannibal Lecter is 10 times more intelligent than Chilton. I think he actually kind of enjoys playing around with Chilton. Chilton's an idiot. But if you pay attention to the cadence, the overall emotional tone of this opening sequence, it starts off nice and light when she meets Chilton, but then as we get closer and closer to her meeting Hannibal Lecter, the tension really rises.
On the afternoon of July 8, 1981, he complained of chest pains and was taken to the dispensary. His mouthpiece and restraints were removed for an EKG.
Especially when Chilton gives her the rules and everything. And so the scene is directed so well, you know, you see the bars opening up and then her just going down the corridor. And there's just this surprise because every inmate that she comes upon before she gets to Hannibal is pretty much the lowest scum of the earth that you can possibly imagine. Miggs even says things that I don't even want to repeat. So then finally she gets to Hannibal, who looks like the complete opposite. He looks like he's polite even. He's definitely got a chilling air about him, but he's just different, very different. And you can tell highly intelligent before he even says a word. Now, after you watch this movie, it's no secret that this really focuses on Clarice Starling as a woman, especially like a young trainee in the FBI. And really the whole movie is through her point of view. And there's a lot of scenes where you'll see like uncomfortable close-ups of whatever Clarice is looking at. You know, she's constantly being evaluated and even like judged throughout a lot of the scenes. A lot of these men don't really take her seriously. And it's interesting to me that after the Me Too movement, there have been quite a few movies that have cropped up trying to foot stomp the feminist movement. And some succeed, some not so well. But I think Silence of the Lambs did it better than any movie I think I've ever seen some 30 years ago. And that's because of Jodie Foster's performance. This is a person that can play strength and vulnerability pretty much all at the same time, which is something that a lot of actresses these days that are trying to enter that movement, they fail to do because they're really wanting to show the strong side, but they forget about the vulnerable side.
That expires in 1 week. You're not real FBI, are you?
I'm still in training at the academy.
Jack Crawford sent a trainee to me.
There's a very evident character arc throughout this movie with Clarice. But the vulnerability is always there, even in the end of the movie when she takes down the killer.
Freeze! Put your hands over your head and turn around. Spread your legs.
And it's ironic that the one person that is constantly judged throughout the whole thing, that is not taken seriously, even by her own boss, Jack Crawford, is the one that ultimately catches the killer because of her tenacity and a little bit because of her vulnerability. She always has her guard up because she's not 100% sure of herself. And sometimes fear can help you. You know, sometimes fear gives you that drive to actually win. And in the end, I think Clarice is just an effective character study, as is Hannibal Lecter and Buffalo Bill. You know, just as interesting, actually. I think if Clarice Starling wasn't as effective or wasn't focused on as she was, I think this movie would have been just another serial killer movie, but Jodie Foster elevates it. Speaking of elevates it, holy shit.
You use Evian skin cream. And sometimes you wear L'Oreal. But not today.
Can you believe the performance by Anthony Hopkins in this movie? The guy was pretty much 100% in control of the character through and through. And what's interesting is that Anthony Hopkins didn't become an A-list actor up until this movie. Yes, he had done The Elephant Man, but his career was pretty much, just a safe B-level actor, which is, there's nothing wrong with that. He made a nice living, but he pretty much thought about giving up acting until this movie. This movie made him an A-list actor, and after this movie, he was nominated, I think, 4 or 5 more times. I hate constantly using like greatest of all time, and I know I've been guilty of overusing it sometimes, but I will say Hannibal Lecter, the version of him played by Anthony Hopkins, is unmatched, pretty much. I mean, he's easily top 5 villains I've ever seen. I'm trying to not say of all time, even though I mean all time. It's scary how good he is in this role, if I'm being honest.
A census taker once tried to test me. I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti.
And the best parts of the movie, to me, aren't really the action scenes, because there's not too many action scenes in the movie. It's the meetings between Clarice and Hannibal, the quid pro quo. And there's only like 4 scenes with them two together. And what I mean by quid pro quo is Hannibal, as part of the deal to help find Buffalo Bill, he wants to know about Clarice's upbringing. He's really interested in Clarice.
Death of my father.
Tell me about it and don't lie, or I'll know.
He was a town marshal, and one night he surprised 2 burglars coming out of the back of a drugstore.
Which is another ironic thing too, because all these men, they think that Hannibal is going to just toss her aside because the guy hasn't talked to anybody, since he was caught. So of course they think he's not going to talk to Clarice, but he becomes really interested in Clarice because he notices how genuine she is. He notices that vulnerability, and I think out of all the characters in this movie, he respects Clarice the most. But like I was saying, they're talking about her past, and after her father died, she went and lived on this like cattle ranch. And what caused her to end up leaving is because she tried to save one of the lambs. And so there's a scene, it's like their final encounter together, where Jodie Foster's performance is next freaking level in this scene. And she's talking about, trying to save the lamb.
Do you think if you save poor Catherine, you could make them stop, don't you? You think if Catherine lives, you won't wake up in the dark ever again to that awful screaming of the lambs.
And just the music, and this is just cinema. Everything came together to make this one of the best scenes of the movie, actually. And it's interesting that Hannibal and Buffalo Bill are 2 very different killers. They're both equally dangerous, and I would say even Hannibal is more deadly than Buffalo Bill. But in this movie, it really kind of humanizes Hannibal, and it demonizes Buffalo Bill. My wife actually did a paper on Silence of the Lambs when she was taking a film class a few years ago. And she still had the paper, and she pulled it up, and she talked about that one segment about, humanizing and demonizing, and it just blew my mind. And I was like, oh my God, I have to use that in my review. So that's why I'm using that. So all the credit to her, but it really makes a lot of sense. For some reason, we see Hannibal is almost like a hero, even like sympathetic in this movie, as deadly as he is, whereas Buffalo Bill is, the evil, the lowest scum of the earth. But both these characters are evil at the end of the day. For example, you never see the violent, graphic nature of Hannibal on screen until later in the movie. It's done through dialogue, explaining how dangerous this guy is, especially the one scene where they describe like one of the orderlies, they let their guard down, and Hannibal attacked the person, biting their face and their tongue off.
Saved one of her eyes. His pulse never got above 85, even when he ate her tongue. I keep him in here.
But really, that just sets the tone of how dangerous Hannibal Lecter is. And it's just proof that you don't always have to show the violence. You know, it can be done through the dialogue if it's good dialogue. Now, the last act of this movie is just so brilliant because you have Jack Crawford and his crew in one location, and you have Clarice in another, and Jack Crawford tells Clarice, hey, we got him, so you can do some background work while we're going to get the guy. And so the whole time, the scene is directed in a way where you think that, you know, Jack Crawford's team, they're closing in on Buffalo Bill, you know, up until Buffalo Bill gets to his door. And then when he opens the door, who do we see? Not Jack Crawford. We see Clarice. I love that misdirection, you know, being able to play around with your audience like that. And again, Jodie Foster's performance in this scene too. Once she gets in the house, she doesn't think anything of it. And then, you know, like a good FBI agent, she looks around and she sees all these clues and everything. And then all of a sudden, it's an example of an actor doing everything without saying a word. If you look at Jodie Foster's face in that scene, it tells you everything. But on the flip side of that, you got to give Ted Levine the credit too.
Hey, don't you hurt my dog!
Don't you make me hurt your dog!
Hey, you don't know what pain is!
Buffalo Bill is an irresistible character. There's a real dark comedic edge to the guy, but that doesn't take away from how dangerous he is. And, you know, the last act where they end up, you know, in the dark, that's where the vulnerability comes through for Clarice. You know, you see her physically trembling and shaking. But through all that, she's still able to let her training take over and do what she's got to do to get the job done. You know, even after she kills the guy, you see her unloading the gun and reloading, and she's physically shaking. You know, it's all acting, but you don't realize that it's acting. It's just amazing how great Jodie Foster is in this movie. So guys, I'm going to give this movie a low humdrum. Just kidding. This is definitely a Trapped on a Freaking Island. It's an amazing, amazing film. It's one that I watch quite often, actually. I probably watch Silence of the Lambs at least every couple of years. So I've seen it quite a few times, actually. Just gave it a fresh watch before this review. But yeah, just brilliant film by Jonathan Demme. Another movie that I would highly recommend from Jonathan Demme that nobody ever talks about is Something Wild, with a very underrated performance by Ray Liotta. Can't recommend that movie enough. So anyway, guys, I'm sure you've seen Silence of the Lambs. Let me know in the comments. And also, let me know some other thrillers in the vein of Silence of the Lambs that you would enjoy. I'm sure I'm going to get some comments for 7 down there. Also, be sure to come over to Killer Flicks, where we talk horror all day and every day. And on Fridays, we do Free Fall Fridays. Follow me at Drumdums on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. Have a great day, and Drumdum out.